Chairman, Deputy Mayor. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. We do have a vote of thanks, but I want to take the opportunity before getting into my remarks to really thank everyone here who has been able to participate by coming, and thank the team headed by Dr. Mohammed for putting this together. It's, I think, a reflection of where the University of Guyana is going, not just to start something, but to continue it. And I look forward to getting your support, tangible support, in enabling us to move from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8. I've been asked to join the other panelists in saying something but a broader context of US Hemispheric relations. But I want to take the opportunity before going there to make a general observation and then get into my remarks. And the general observation is this. As I, along with thousands of others across the globe, reacted and pondered the outcome of the elections, and keep in mind the significance of the elections extend beyond the elections of the president. These elections of last week have shaped the American political landscape in other significant ways. You have, for the first time, one political party not only controlling the executive branch, but both houses of the legislature and controlling most of the gubernatorial centers of power. Most of the governors are Republican. And I think in the context of, even if only you were to focus on the election of a very extraordinary, unique candidate called Donald J. Trump, many perplexions have been reflected. And what I thought was perhaps something that would encapsulate people's concern about the moment and the implications of the moment is something written by Charles Dickens many years ago. And I went back to Tale of Two Cities. And I'll read you what, for me, and I suspect for many others, something that Charles Dickens wrote is in the mind of many people, not only in the United States, but in many parts of the world. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct to the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period, how prophetic, that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on it being received for good and for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. Charles Dickens, Tale of Two Cities. There are many people who, even if they don't know of this great work, are thinking, my God, what are we into now? Best of times, the worst of times. So allow me, Mr. Chairman, to turn to my 7 minutes, 7 Guyanese minutes, 8 or 9 regular minutes. And the proposition is to offer some thoughts on the relationships, the implications of the elections on Hemisphere, Latin America, Caribbean in particular. Now, Dr. Reynolds, in her remarks, pointed out that there are various levels of analysis that one can bring to the conversation in looking at US implications of the electoral change on the hemisphere. You can use the individual level of analysis. You can also have the international level of the analysis. I'm going to spend my time focusing more on the international and come back later on as we have the discourse to weave some of the individual. Because the individual in the Caribbean and in many parts of Latin America, Central and South, is in some people's minds more threatening than the international. When you think of the implications for immigration, it is the individual where the areas of concern are aggravated, amplified. But for the moment, we are going to focus on the interstate dynamics, the international level of analysis. And I thought that I would go back in looking at the implications for United States electoral change on the hemisphere, and knowing that we're focusing on the international, the state, connecting with other states. I thought I would go back to the early parts of the foundation of the United States as a nation state, as a power. And we all know that the first president of the United States was George Washington. But we also know that before there was these United States, there were confederations. There was a war. And George Washington was an important part of that war, but there were several other people in the states that had been exercising discontent. And many of those important generals and political movers and shakers corresponded with each other. And George Washington had a favorite planter from South Carolina with whom he did a lot of corresponding. It's a general called Henry Lawrence. And I want to share with you an excerpt from a letter that George Washington wrote to Henry Lawrence. Actually, it was November 14, 1778. And you'll see in a minute why where I'm going is connected to broader than the individual. So here is what George Washington wrote in that letter, November 14, 1778. He said, "It's a maxim founded on the universal experience of mankind that no nation is to be trusted further than it is bound by its interests, and no prudent statesman or politician will venture to depart from it." What George Washington wrote back in the 18th century, over time became a cardinal rule of interstate relations, international relations. And that is, the individuals matter, but more important than the individuals is the national interest. What was said in 1778 has been consistent in the United States and adopted by many other states over the past centuries. I say that to say to you that, and part of what Ambassador Giraud said connects to this. Yes, there is earth-shattering change. Yes, there is an unorthodox president. But keep in mind that the individual president in his dictates, in his vision, is going to be mediated by the national interests that he does not alone set. The national interests. George Washington was reminding Henry Laurent in 1778, and it became a cardinal feature of how the United States worked, and it became a feature of how other nations operate in their international discourse. And so the logical question now becomes, if you think that, if you accept the proposition that the national interest is an important desideratum in interstate relations, in international relations, what might be the national interests of the United States in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America and the Caribbean. A definition of those interests would allow you to see where the areas for concern or non-concern might exist. And so what I'd like to do is to share with you my interpretation of what United States national interests in our part of the world are all about. And then later on we can have a conversation about what do those interests mean in practical relational terms to Guyana. What might they mean in practical relational terms to the rest of the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and North America? But before I go to my 5 primary US interests in this hemisphere, I want to offer a couple of caveats. And the first caveat is to say that the interests that I will outline in a minute as being the interests of the United States in this part of the world are not interests limited only to this part of the world. Some of these interests are interests the United States have in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in the Antarctic. So there is not an exclusivity of, in my view, the interests that I will outline in relation to the United States and this part of the world, but there is, for purpose of this conversation, we're focusing on this part of the world. The second caveat I would offer is that as we outline the interests, and there are 5 major ones, I think it's important to keep in mind, and this is true of all nations, the implementation, the pursuits of those interests are not necessarily going to be the same way with every country in the hemisphere. You may have a general national interest in, let's say, democracy, but how you pursue policies and programs regarding democracy in Nicaragua may be different than how you pursue policies and programs in regard to democracy in Canada. So it is not a unanimity of interpretation and implementation. But here is an important 4th caveat. While in relation to the United States, we think of international relations, of the execution of national interests, as being something that is the lead preserve of the executive branch, executed largely by the State Department, the Defense Department, the Commerce Department, the Agriculture Department, and some others. And High Commissioner Giroux made reference to it. National interest pursuits are not only the preserve of the executive branch. Congress has a significant say in what happens in the definition of policy and the execution of policy. The Supreme Court can have a significant say in the interpretation of laws to effectuate those policies. And this is part of the complexity of the United States. Many of the policies require state action. And so the disposition of the state can make a difference as to whether the United States goes on this road or that road, even though it says its policy is going to be on that road. There is not a one center of gravity in the execution of foreign policy. The complexity of the United States means there is a lead branch, executive, but that is not the only branch whose actions matter. So let me offer you my 5 areas of interest, keeping in mind again, and I'll repeat for the colleagues who came in late, what George Washington said on November 14, 1778. It is a maxim founded on the universal experience of mankind that no nation is to be trusted further than it is bound by its interests, and no prudent statesman or politician will venture to depart from it. Now, one might argue that Mr. Trump has not been saying prudent things. But we have begun already to see the difference between candidate Trump and President-elect Trump. And so the national interests are going to contort the Trump that we saw during the elections. It doesn't mean that everything will change. And the uncertainty and the instability precipitated by some of what has already been said. But bigger than Trump is the United States' interests. And whether you are a cynic or not, there are entities in the United States that will not allow any single individual, even if it's the president, to undermine their interests or their part of the pie. So let me share with you what is my interpretation of one important national interest of the United States in our part of the world, Latin America, Caribbean, North America. Democracy. A fundamental, a cardinal feature of what America thinks should be the way in which states govern themselves, should be the way in which it, the United States, enables or sometimes works counter to be sure that democracy is not only exercised in the part of the hemisphere called the United States and Canada, but it is sustained and pursued both as ideology and praxis is democracy. So I would say that top of the list is United States interests in this part of the world is to ensure that democratic practice, democratic institutions, democratic ideology. Now you may not hear that as a refrain post-1991 since the Cold War ended, but the end of the Cold War has not meant a diminution of interest in democracy on the part of the United States. It is still a cardinal national interest of the United States. When you think of a possible second, and these are not necessarily in any rank order of importance, but if you think of any second interest that the United States would have in Latin America, Caribbean, North America, Canada, geonarcotics is right up there. The United States is still the recipient of drugs coming from South America, from the Caribbean, through Caribbean, from other parts of the world, from Africa and Asia, through South America, through the Caribbean. About a decade and a half when I was in Uruguay for a conference, you had a set of folks who were not from South America arrested in Uruguay. The question was, what are they doing in Uruguay? They're bringing the drugs that were taken from Colombia first, but in order to kind of confuse the American authorities, they take the same drugs all the way to Africa and then bring them back. So it is not only drugs originating in South America or the Caribbean. It is not only drugs that originate in another part of the way, it's how the Caribbean, how Central America, how South America are providing a challenge, a clear and present danger as seen by the United States in the infusion, in the flow of illegal substances into the United States. Now the reality is, the definition of the American political landscape is being shifted because of what some states are doing to decriminalize within their states. Not only for medicinal purposes, but also for recreational purposes. Notwithstanding that, I think that there's going to be for a good while a significant interest on the part of the United States in countering the flow of narcotics, whether it's poppy from Colombia and Mexico, or heroin, or ganja from the Caribbean. You may know that St. Vincent, small as it is the second largest exporter of marijuana to the United States. And so it is the concern about illegal flows of drugs that are part of the definition, in my mind, of the interests of these United States. But here's a third. Although the Cold War has ended, geopolitics is still important to the United States. And ever since the late 1990s, a resurgence, an expansion of terrorism of one kind or another has meant that geopolitics and counterterrorism is part of a significant portrait of what America says is its national interest. Now, you may take comfort in the fact that we don't have any significant indigenous terrorism against the United States in Caribbean, in Central America, in South America. But there is also evidence that the United States has reason to be worried about terrorism in the Caribbean, connected to terrorism outside of the Caribbean, or terrorist intents in the Caribbean. I wouldn't feel comforted if I were Trump, knowing that in a tiny island called Trinidad and Tobago, you have people who are not only leaving to go fight, but being part of promotional videos. I wouldn't feel comforted in knowing that the Tri-Junction area in South America facilitates a lot of movement from the Middle East. And so whether you're looking at the porous borders between Canada and the United States as an enabling vulnerability, or you know of the connectivity between financing in parts of South America and facilitating through money laundering to places outside of this hemisphere, the worry about the Caribbean, the worry about South America being a facilitator of terrorism is something that is on the minds of people in the United States. But here is what I would put right behind that. And whether or not you believe Mr. Trump is going to build this wall and make Mexico pay for it, immigration issues are part of what the United States has as its national interest concern. And we'll talk in a minute, if time permits, about what are some of the implications of an immigration policy pursuit. You scaled it down from 11 million, maybe just send back 2 to 3 million. 2 to 3 million can have serious implications for Caribbean and South American countries. And we can talk about some of that, especially in the context of deportees. We'll come to talk a little bit about that. So immigration would be fourth on my list. Again, not in any order of rank importance. But I will also add to that list another G word, geoeconomics. United States is worried about retaining global competitiveness and the extent to which it is enabled to retain that competitiveness by what it does on trade and financing with Caribbean countries, Central American countries, South American countries, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, whether on the part of a bloc, say Mercosur, or through the international financing institutions that influence what Caribbean, South American, and Central American countries do. Geoeconomics, the implications for trade, the implications for investment. And I might make this point as I resume my seat, that none of these national interest areas isolate itself in its operation. There's a connectivity between immigration and geopolitics. There's a connectivity between geoeconomics and migration. And so, while I end, I would remind us or encourage us to think of not only these areas. When we come to the discussion, we're going to talk a little bit perhaps about the interconnectivity. What are the implications of the impact of one on another? And what are the implications of Mr. Trump actualizing some of the platitudes he offered during the campaign, even if reminding ourselves again that the national interest is going to compel him to modify his behavior. Now, I'm not going to abandon NATO. Well, the military-industrial complex would not allow him to abandon NATO. The powers in Europe and even in the Pacific, in parts of Southern Asia that rely upon the residual presence of a NATO, will not allow him. But keep in mind that there are implications of the connectivity between each of these national interests, and I thought it would be useful for us to at least list them, and we can come later on to talk about what they mean in practical terms, even if the national interest takes superordinance, as I think it will. Mr. Trump is going to have to pick some low-hanging fruit and give to his supporters. And so maybe that 3 million coming back is a low-hanging fruit he will give to people. Even if you focus on that, there are potential dangers for the Caribbean, and including Guyana. Thank you.